chosen one. The persistent focus placed on a single individual within any group often reveals more about the group itself than about the person being targeted. When a collective repeatedly feels compelled to explain why one individual is considered the problem, it is frequently because reality no longer supports the narrative they are attempting to maintain. This pattern appears across social environments of all kinds, including families, workplaces, religious institutions, digital communities, and informal networks. In each case, the mechanics are strikingly similar. One person becomes the focal point of criticism, suspicion, or blame, even long after any practical reason for conflict should have ended. What makes this phenomenon notable is that the scrutiny often intensifies rather than dissolves. When the individual withdraws, improves their circumstances, or chooses silence, instead of resolving the issue, distance seems to amplify it. This escalation is not a sign of confidence or clarity. It is a signal that the existing explanation has begun to collapse under its own weight. Psychological research into group dynamics consistently shows that sustained hostility toward an individual is rarely driven by surface-level disagreements. Groups do not expend prolonged energy targeting someone who is irrelevant. Long-term fixation typically emerges when an individual's presence disrupts a shared belief system. This disruption does not require confrontation, dominance, or public opposition. Often, it occurs quietly through consistency, restraint, or visible independence. The contradiction alone is enough. When a group encounters such a contradiction, it faces two options. It can adjust its assumptions and evolve, or it can preserve comfort by redirecting discomfort outward. The latter option is chosen more often because it demands less self-examination. Admitting that the group's internal narrative is flawed requires accountability, and accountability threatens stability built on agreement rather than truth. If the individual being targeted truly lacked influence or relevance, attention would naturally fade. Silence would suffice. Distance would dissolve the issue. Smear efforts typically lose momentum quickly when they are unsupported by observable reality. However, when a narrative persists despite a lack of reinforcement, it suggests that something unresolved remains visible. The continued discussion is not evidence of guilt. It is evidence of friction between perception and outcome. Over time, observers begin to notice inconsistencies. The accusations remain static while the individual continues to progress. The story being told requires repeated reinforcement, as if it can only survive through constant repetition. Each retelling functions less as clarification and more as maintenance. This imbalance draws attention, not away from the individual, but toward those attempting to control the narrative. Ironically, the pressure applied to expose perceived flaws often achieves the opposite effect. Instead of revealing instability, it highlights steadiness. Instead of provoking collapse, it documents endurance. The expected outcome fails to materialize, and that failure creates discomfort. When a group anticipates breakdown but witnesses composure instead, its authority begins to weaken. At that point, the conflict ceases to be about behavior or accountability. It becomes about preserving the original explanation at all costs. The individual's continued stability undermines the justification for hostility, forcing those invested in the narrative to escalate rather than reassess. This escalation is not strategic. It is reactive. One of the clearest indicators of narrative collapse is repetition. When new information disappears and old claims are recycled, belief has begun to erode. Truth does not require constant reminders. In contrast, fragile explanations rely on repetition to suppress doubt. The shift from specificity to generalization signals a loss of confidence. What further destabilizes the situation is restraint. The individual does not need to argue, retaliate, or clarify. Consistency alone introduces contrast. While accusations attempt to define identity, lived behavior contradicts it quietly and persistently. This gap exposes motives. The focus shifts from addressing concerns to managing perception. Many such situations are structured around emotional exhaustion. Prolonged pressure is intended to provoke reaction, fatigue, or self-sabotage. When that reaction does not occur, confusion sets in. Restraint disrupts expectation. Without emotional confirmation, the strategy loses direction. As the pressure continues without results, urgency replaces certainty. The intensity increases not because it is effective, but because alternatives have been exhausted. At this stage, the group is no longer responding to actions or statements. It is reacting to outcomes it cannot control. Time plays a decisive role here. Initial assumptions often rely on short-term observation. Endurance, however, operates over extended periods. Anyone can simulate composure briefly. Sustained steadiness under prolonged scrutiny is more difficult to dismiss. Over time, endurance becomes evidence. The longer the individual remains measured, the weaker the accusations appear. The predicted behavior fails to manifest. There is no public collapse, no confirmation of instability, no moment that validates the original claim. This absence forces a shift in focus. The survival itself becomes suspicious when endurance cannot be attacked directly. It is reframed negatively. Calm becomes calculation. Silence becomes manipulation. Stability becomes defiance. These reinterpretations signal that the original framework no longer applies. The theory failed. Another layer of tension emerges. When the individual's presence reveals unspoken hierarchies, many environments operate on implicit rules. Some individuals are granted grace, while others are scrutinized. Some mistakes are excused, while others are amplified. These structures remain invisible as long as everyone conforms. When someone operates without performing deference, these hierarchies become noticeable. The contrast exposes disparities in treatment. Authority begins to feel conditional rather than inherent. This threatens systems that rely on assumed legitimacy rather than transparency. Initial pressure in such cases is often corrective rather than punitive. The goal is to reposition the individual without acknowledging the hierarchy itself. When this fails, frustration grows. Continued independence challenges the expectation of compliance. The situation escalates further when influence forms organically. A tension that develops without endorsement destabilizes control-based systems. Influence is expected to flow downward. When it rises laterally, it generates unease. Attempts to suppress such influence often serve as warnings to others. The message becomes implicit. Deviation has consequences. However, these efforts frequently backfire. The more pressure applied, the clearer the imbalance becomes. Observers notice who is protected and who is targeted. The system reveals itself. Another consequence of prolonged scrutiny is documentation. Statements made confidently in the past become fixed points. Over time, behavior fails to align with those statements. The record contradicts the present explanation. This creates defensiveness. Revisions of history begin to appear. Context is reframed. Certainty is softened. These adjustments are not clarifications. They are evasions. The past no longer supports the present claim. What intensifies discomfort is that the individual did not need to gather evidence deliberately. The repetition created its own record. Each accusation added another layer to the contrast between claim and reality. At this stage, anger often replaces argument. Mockery replaces explanation. Attempts are made to discredit the concept of evidence itself. These reactions reflect pressure rather than confidence. The record exists regardless of interpretation. Group cohesion also begins to strain. Unity based on opposition is inherently fragile. Without a shared adversary, internal differences surface. Loyalty becomes transactional. Confidence erodes. The continued targeting is no longer about correction. It is about maintaining cohesion. The individual functions as a stabilizing enemy. Removing that role would force introspection. Ironically, each attempt to diminish the individual highlights the group's dependence on opposition. Strength built on resistance rather than principle collapses under scrutiny. Meanwhile, observers form conclusions independently. Recognition develops without orchestration. Influence emerges through consistency rather than persuasion. This type of recognition cannot be revoked. The group struggles because its assumptions about control are invalidated. Influence was expected to be granted. Instead, it was observed. This shift alters the balance of power. The focus on the individual intensifies, often eclipsing self-assessment. Energy is spent monitoring rather than reflecting. This imbalance fuels frustration. As scrutiny increases, unpredictability grows. The individual does not react as anticipated. Patterns fail to produce control. This unpredictability undermines confidence. At the same time, self-examination remains absent. The group understands the individual's behavior better than its own motivations. This avoidance sustains the conflict. Eventually, the realization emerges that the individual has outgrown the role assigned to them. Expectations no longer apply. Growth exceeds the framework designed to contain it. Attempts to provoke outdated responses continue. The strategy relies on a version of the individual that no longer exists. Each failed provocation reinforces that reality. Approval, once assumed to be necessary, proves irrelevant. The individual remains intact without validation. This autonomy exposes the limits of influence. Repeated attacks become rehearsals, not persuasion. The narrative is repeated to reassure its creators rather than convince others. Doubt has already taken hold. Finally, the environment itself is exposed. While others were shaped by its pressures, the individual remained unaffected. The system failed selectively. That failure becomes undeniable. The moment a system realizes that its influence no longer produces the intended response is the moment its internal weaknesses begin to surface. What was once presented as authority starts to resemble dependency. The group's behavior shifts from confident enforcement to anxious monitoring. Attention is no longer strategic. It becomes compulsive. Every action taken by the individual is watched closely, not to understand, but to confirm an expectation that has already failed multiple times. This stage is marked by a subtle but important reversal. Initially, the individual was framed as needing correction, guidance, or containment. Now, without any explicit acknowledgement, the group's actions reveal that it is the one seeking reassurance. Silence from the individual creates more discomfort than confrontation ever did. Absence becomes louder than presence because it removes the last illusion of control. What follows is often an attempt to redefine the rules retroactively. Standards are adjusted. Timelines are rewritten. What was once considered acceptable is quietly reclassified as problematic. These changes are not announced openly. They emerge through inconsistency. The goal is not fairness, but restoration of leverage. Yet leverage requires relevance, and relevance cannot be forced when attention has already shifted. The individual's independence introduces a new variable, choice. When engagement becomes optional, power dynamics change fundamentally. Influence that relies on obligation collapses when obligation is no longer recognized. Observers begin to notice this shift, even if they cannot articulate it precisely. The contrast between effort and outcome becomes visible. The group expends increasing energy with diminishing returns. The individual, by contrast, maintains a steady pace, unaffected by escalation. This asymmetry erodes credibility. At this point, frustration often turns inward, though it is rarely acknowledged as such. Internal disagreements surface, disguised as strategy discussions or moral debates. The shared narrative that once unified the group begins to fracture. Some members question the continued fixation, while others double down, mistaking persistence for principle. This divergence creates instability, when cohesion was built on opposition rather than shared values. Removing the opposition leaves little to hold the structure together. The individual's refusal to re-engage accelerates this process. Without a reactive counterpart, unresolved tensions have nowhere to go but inward. Attempts may be made to provoke a response indirectly. Messages are framed ambiguously. Actions are taken that appear coincidental but are clearly timed. These efforts are designed to test whether emotional access still exists. When they fail, discouragement sets in. What is often misunderstood in these situations is that disengagement is not the same as indifference. The individual is aware, but no longer invested. This distinction matters. Indifference implies apathy. Disengagement implies discernment. The choice not to respond is intentional, not unconscious. As time passes, the narrative loses coherence. Contradictions accumulate. Statements made to justify earlier actions conflict with later explanations. The story becomes layered with exceptions, conditions, and revisions. Each addition weakens the structure further. The group may attempt to externalize this confusion by attributing it to complexity or misunderstanding. However, complexity does not produce contradiction. Avoidance does. The refusal to confront foundational assumptions ensures that surface-level adjustments will never resolve the issue. Meanwhile, the individual continues to operate outside the framework entirely. Their behavior is not oppositional. It is independent. This distinction is critical. Opposition still acknowledges the system. Independence renders it irrelevant. This irrelevance is the source of the group's greatest discomfort. Systems are designed to manage dissent, not absence. When the individual no longer seeks approval or reacts to disapproval, traditional mechanisms fail. In response, there's often an attempt to reassert significance through moral framing. The conflict is recast as a matter of values rather than control. Language becomes more abstract, less specific. Concepts replace evidence. This shift is meant to elevate the discussion while avoiding accountability. However, abstraction creates distance from observable reality. Without concrete examples, persuasion weakens. Those observing from the outside rely on consistency, not rhetoric, to form conclusions. When rhetoric intensifies while behavior remains unchanged, skepticism grows. Another tactic involves selective acknowledgement. Achievements are minimized or reframed as problematic. Neutral actions are interpreted as intentional slights. This reinterpretation attempts to maintain relevance by inserting meaning where none was offered. Yet this strategy depends on shared acceptance. When observers no longer interpret events through the same lens, the reinterpretation fails. Meaning cannot be imposed unilaterally. The individual's continued restraint plays a decisive role here. By not correcting misinterpretations publicly, they allow discrepancies to remain visible. The absence of counter-argument forces observers to compare narratives against outcomes independently. Over time, this independent evaluation leads to quiet conclusions. No announcement is made. No allegiance is declared. Understanding develops organically. Influence shifts without ceremony. The group senses this shift but cannot pinpoint its cause. Attention has moved, but there is no single moment to address. This ambiguity creates anxiety. Control depends on predictability. Organic change resists it. As influence wanes, urgency increases. Decisions become reactive. Long-term considerations are sacrificed for immediate reassurance. This short-term thinking accelerates decline. Internal credibility suffers as well. When explanations change frequently, trust erodes. members begin to question not only the narrative about the individual, but other narratives maintained by the group. Doubt spreads laterally. This doubt is often met with calls for loyalty. Unity is emphasized over clarity. Questions are framed as threats. These responses reveal insecurity rather than strength. At this stage, the group's behavior begins to resemble what it once accused the individual of being. Projection becomes evident. Traits previously criticized are now displayed openly. This mirroring is not lost on observers. The individual, meanwhile, is no longer part of the equation emotionally. The conflict has outlived its relevance. Growth has rendered the original dynamic obsolete. What remains is a mismatch between reality and narrative. The group continues to operate as if the individual occupies a central role, while the individual has moved on entirely. This imbalance creates a feedback loop of frustration. Eventually, exhaustion sets in. Sustaining a narrative without reinforcement is draining. Energy dissipates. Attention drifts elsewhere. The conflict loses momentum not because it was resolved, but because it could no longer be sustained. This ending is rarely dramatic. There is no admission, no closure statement, no acknowledgement of error. The narrative simply fades. Focus shifts to new concerns. The individual is no longer mentioned. What persists, however, is the record. Actions taken, statements made, and patterns displayed remain observable. Those who paid attention remember. Lessons are drawn quietly. For the individual, the outcome is not vindication, but clarity. The experience confirms what was already understood. Stability does not require permission, and growth does not need consensus. Autonomy proves to be the most effective response, not as resistance, but as refusal to participate in distortion. By maintaining alignment with reality rather than narrative, the individual avoids entanglement. The broader implication is significant. Systems that rely on control rather than coherence cannot sustain scrutiny indefinitely. They require participation to function. Withdrawal exposes their limits. This is not a call to disengage from all structures, but a recognition that not all structures deserve engagement. Discernment replaces reaction. Choice replaces obligation. In the end, the conflict dissolves not because one side prevailed, but because the premise itself expired. The assumptions that sustained it no longer applied. Growth rendered them irrelevant. What remains is a clear distinction between influence earned through consistency and authority enforced through pressure. One endures, the other decays. What happens after the struggle dissolves is rarely discussed, yet it is the most consequential phase of all. Once the tension fades and the narrative loses momentum, there's a space that opens subtle, quiet, and often unfamiliar. This space is not emptiness. It is integration. It is where everything that was endured, observed, restrained, and understood finally settles into coherence. At this stage, there is no need to explain, defend, or revisit the past. Explanation belongs to conflict. Defense belongs to threat, and revisiting belongs to unresolved attachment. When growth reaches completion, these impulses naturally fall away, not because effort is required to suppress them, but because they no longer serve a purpose. What remains is a calm authority that does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition or validation. It exists as a byproduct of alignment. This authority is quiet, but it is unmistakable. It shows up in restraint, in measured response, and in the absence of urgency. Many people assume closure comes through acknowledgement from others. In reality, closure comes when internal questioning ends, when the mind no longer replays events searching for alternative outcomes, when emotional energy is reclaimed and redirected toward the present. This redirection is not dramatic. It is practical. Attention returns to work that matters, relationships that are reciprocal, Goals that are rooted in reality rather than reaction. Life begins to feel grounded again, not because circumstances are perfect, but because internal stability has been restored. One of the clearest signs of completion is neutrality. Not indifference, but neutrality. Events from the past can be recalled without emotional charge. Names can be mentioned without tension. Situations can be evaluated without bias. This neutrality is not forgetfulness. It is mastery. Mastery does not mean control over others. It means control over internal response. It means the ability to observe without being pulled back into old dynamics. This is where true freedom exists. At this level, insight deepens. Patterns that once felt personal are recognized as structural. Behavior that once felt targeted is understood as predictable. This understanding dissolves resentment. Resentment requires personalization. Clarity removes it. Forgiveness often follows naturally, but not in the way it is commonly portrayed. Forgiveness here is not reconciliation. It is release. It is the decision not to carry the weight of another system's limitations. It is choosing not to internalize dysfunction. With release comes capacity. Energy that was once tied up in vigilance becomes available for creation. Focus sharpens. Intuition stabilizes. Decisions become less reactive and more deliberate. This is also the phase where identity consolidates. Not identity defined by opposition or survival, but identity rooted in values and direction. When identity stabilizes, external disruption loses power. There is nothing left to prove. At this point, the individual no longer measures progress by comparison. Comparison belongs to uncertainty. Progress is measured by alignment, by whether actions reflect intention, whether effort supports long-term sustainability, and whether growth feels integrated rather than forced. There's also a noticeable shift in how time is experienced. Urgency fades. Patience becomes embodied rather than practiced. The need for immediate outcomes diminishes because confidence in process has been established. This confidence is not blind optimism. It is evidence-based. It is built from having witnessed patterns resolve without interference, from having trusted restraint and seen it produce clarity, from having chosen integrity over immediacy. As this trust solidifies, discernment sharpens further. Not everything requires engagement. Not every opportunity aligns. Selectivity becomes natural. Energy is allocated where it produces meaning, not noise. Another important change occurs in communication. Words become fewer but more precise. There is less explanation, less justification, and more presence. Silence is no longer uncomfortable. It is functional. This does not lead to isolation. On the contrary, connections become more authentic. Relationships that remain are those that can exist without manipulation, competition, or hidden agendas. Mutual respect replaces negotiation. At this stage, influence becomes indirect but powerful. Others observe consistency over time. They notice calm under pressure. They notice boundaries that are firm but not aggressive. Trust develops organically. This kind of influence does not seek followers. It attracts alignment. People engage because coherence is compelling. Stability invites participation without persuasion. Importantly, there is no temptation to return to old dynamics. The cost is now visible. The individual understands what participation required and what it depleted. Wisdom removes nostalgia. Occasionally, reminders surface memories, external references, or indirect mentions. These no longer trigger reaction. They serve as markers of distance traveled, evidence of transformation rather than unresolved emotion. The final phase is not about elevation above others. It is about groundedness within oneself. Humility remains intact. Awareness remains open. Growth continues, but without upheaval. This is where responsibility matures. Not responsibility to fix systems or correct others, but responsibility to maintain alignment. Maintenance becomes the primary task. Maintenance includes reflection, recalibration, and rest. It includes protecting boundaries without hostility. It includes choosing simplicity over complexity when possible. At this level, rest is no longer guilt-inducing. It is strategic. Recovery is understood as essential to clarity. Exhaustion is recognized as a signal, not a virtue. Another shift involves trust in timing. The need to force outcomes dissolves. Experience has shown that interference often delays resolution. Allowing processes to unfold becomes the default approach. This does not mean passivity. Action still occurs, but it is intentional. It is guided by assessment rather than impulse. Each step serves a purpose beyond immediate relief. Perspective also broadens. Situations are evaluated in context rather than isolation. Emotional responses are informed by long-term patterns rather than short-term discomfort. This broader view reduces volatility. Stability becomes the norm rather than the exception. Even challenges are approached with analysis rather than alarm. The individual now operates from a place of internal authority. Decisions are validated internally before they are ever expressed externally. This reduces dependence on feedback. External opinions are considered, not absorbed. Advice is weighed, not obeyed. Autonomy is balanced with openness. One of the most important outcomes of this phase is peace, not the absence of difficulty, but the absence of internal conflict. When inner alignment is achieved, external friction loses intensity. This peace is practical. It improves concentration. It supports health. It enhances creativity. It allows for sustained contribution. At this stage, contribution becomes intentional, whether through work, mentorship, creation, or leadership. Impact is guided by discernment rather than ego. Teaching, if it occurs, is grounded in experience rather than theory. Insight is shared without agenda. Others are allowed to draw their own conclusions. This restraint increases credibility. People trust what is not being sold. They respect what is not imposed. As time passes, the past conflict becomes a closed chapter, not erased, but contextualized. It is part of the foundation, not the focus. The individual does not revisit it unless necessary. And even then, without emotional entanglement, the lesson has been extracted. The purpose fulfilled. Completion does not feel like triumph. It feels like resolution. It feels like clarity without commentary. The final indicator of completion is presence. Attention is fully in the present rather than divided between what was and what might be. Life is engaged directly. This presence supports adaptability. New challenges are met without old baggage. Each situation is assessed on its own terms. The journey does not end here. Growth continues, but it continues without fragmentation, without distortion, without the need for conflict as catalyst. What began as tension concludes as integration. What began as resistance resolves as autonomy. What began as silence becomes understanding. And what began as external pressure ends in internal authority. This is not an ending marked by noise or recognition. It is marked by steadiness, by coherence, by the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needs to prove they have arrived, because they are already moving forward, aligned, complete, and unburdened. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to pause before moving on, not to overthink it, not to analyze every word, but simply to notice what stirred internally. That response matters. Awareness is often the first sign that alignment is already in motion. This is not content meant to be consumed quickly and forgotten. It is meant to be reflected on, revisited, and applied quietly. Growth does not always announce itself through dramatic change. More often, It shows up as subtle clarity, steadier decisions, and a reduced need for external validation. If you recognize those shifts beginning to form, honor them. If you feel encouraged to stay connected, this is your invitation. Subscribe, not as a habit, but as a choice to engage with material that values clarity over noise, depth over urgency, and consistency over intensity. Each message here is designed to support grounded thinking, discernment, and long-term alignment, not emotional spikes or fleeting motivation. If you found value in this, consider sharing it with someone who may be navigating a similar transition. Not to convince them, not to explain anything on their behalf, but simply to offer perspective. Sometimes the most helpful thing we can do is make clarity available and allow others to decide what to take from it. Engagement here is not measured by numbers alone. A thoughtful comment, a moment of reflection, or a quiet decision to apply what resonated carries far more weight than surface interaction. If something stood out to you, acknowledge it. Writing it down, even privately, can help integrate understanding into action. Remember, alignment is maintained through consistency, not pressure. You are not behind. You are not late. You are not missing something others have. Development unfolds at the pace required for stability, not speed. Trusting that process is part of the work. Stay attentive to what supports clarity and release what introduces unnecessary noise. Choose environments, conversations, and commitments that respect your boundaries and reinforce your direction. Progress does not require approval, only integrity. Thank you for spending this time here. If you choose to continue, do so with intention, not because you need guidance, but because refinement is an ongoing practice. The journey forward is not about becoming someone else. It is about continuing as you are more aware, more grounded, and more aligned.